Lawrence Stephen Lowry, rent collector and painter. Well, he doesn't look a very exciting gentleman, not a sort of James Bond character. I can't understand why he looks so bored in Sunderland here, a city that he knew very well and liked quite deeply. But he certainly doesn't look a scintillating character, does he? And if we just restricted ourselves to the bare bones, the simple, straightforward facts, I think you'd find him a very banal, prosaic character indeed. Very briefly, he's born on the 1st of November 87 in 8 Barrett Street, Old Trafford. Don't go looking for the house now. It's been demolished, unfortunately. And I must say that I wasn't very impressed with the choice of parents that Lowry made. He could have chosen perhaps better parents, if you like. His mother, Elizabeth, was brought up in Manchester in a reasonably prosperous household where Christian values were strictly observed. She had several gifts. She was an accomplished pianist, but she was always delicate, something of a hypochondriac, but that didn't stop her living into her 80s. And she had a rather superior attitude amongst the people she dealt with. Her father, poor old Robert Lowry, both of his parents had died while he was still very small. He became a so-called Manchester orphan, brought up in the Oldham Bluecoat School. The school still exists. In that school, he received a strict but very narrow education, which stressed obedience, humility, and good writing. What would he become? He became a clerk, and his son, in fact, would follow to some extent in his footsteps. Lowry's father was a very mild-mannered man who concerned himself, quite rightly, with his wife's health, but he endured her dominance with a patience that was neither wise nor perceptive. To his son, Robert always seemed to be a cold fish. Well, they didn't stay in Old Trafford that long. In 1898, at the age of 11, Lowry, or Lowry as we'll call him, Lowry and his family moved upmarket to another rented house in Victoria Park, a private estate where a certain Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst also lived, apparently. Lowry's childhood was a lonely one. He was privately educated, and in these early years, you could, if you wanted, divide his life perhaps into 3 sections. There was the life at home with mother and father, and by he got to, I think, 15, certainly 1903, he had a day job as a clerk in an estate agency. And in the evening, he attended art classes, and he attended art classes for something like 25 years. So he wasn't, in fact, a self-taught man at all. And in those early years, we have his first artistic phase, if we can divide them into phases. But in those first years, he concentrated mainly on still life, portraits, landscapes, and seascapes. And then another key date was 1909. Lowry is now 22 years of age, and the family could no longer, I think, keep up the payments for the rent in Victoria Park. They had to take a move down market to a northern suburb of Manchester called Pendlebury. They went to live in Station Road. Rather perhaps a downgrade from what the family had been used to. But it had an effect, a very important effect on Lowry. He had while they were living for a long time in Pendlebury, he had a sort of romanticized revelation, perhaps, which inspired perhaps this later scene. What I mean is this: those ugly, dirty, sordid streets, they hid a certain romanticism for Lowry, he came to realize. He says that one day he missed a train from Pendlebury, and as he walked out of the station, he happened to look up at the Acme Spinning Company's mill. Now, I'm not saying this picture is of that, but maybe it inspired him. The huge black framework of rows of yellow-lit windows stood up against the sad, damp-charged afternoon sky. The mill was turning out hundreds of its workers off home, off to the pub. And as he watched this scene, and I think this is important, as he watched this scene, which of course he'd looked at many times before, but without really seeing it, he watched the scene, he tells us, with rapture. And these were the years of, if you like, artistic phase 2, the phase that we know Lowry mainly for, as in this picture, the industrial scenes, the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, a formula that took at least 15 years for him to fully develop. And if we rush very quickly on in this extremely brief and scanty chronology, we come to 1939, when there's a traumatic event in his life, his mother's death. And here he would enter the third and final artistic phase, if you like. Unfortunately, I should have shown you that picture before. Part of his job was collecting rents, and he used his eyes. He wandered the streets of Manchester and Pendlebury. He used his eyes to good effect. His mother dies in 1939. His painting takes on a very different dimension. He concentrates on unfortunates, as in The Cripples, 1949, gaunt men with anguish in their eyes, some bleak landscapes, sometimes crowned, as is here, by a single black monolith. And these were the years from about the beginning of the Second World War, where slow, and I emphasize that, slow, painful success at last came to Lowry. Eventually, there would be exhibitions and sales and honours. However, ladies and gentlemen, these are just the bare bones of a man's life. And they don't offer a complete picture of a complicated, complex man, I don't think. And I think, at least I found it useful to think of Lowry's life as a series of contrasts, or even in some cases, of contradictions. One of those contrasts might be he was an extremely modest, retiring gentleman, but for somebody with that character, he had great success. Modest, but great achievement. And it's not difficult to explain away his modesty, I don't think. Here's his mother, Elizabeth. Elizabeth falls pregnant. This is not a happy event for her. This will clip her wings. She will not be able to practice and perform as a pianist, for example, or go on the social round anymore. She doesn't greet her pregnancy with happiness, but rather with alarm and despondency. And then things get even worse because it's a boy, a girl perhaps she could have put up with. But Lowry, I'm afraid, dashed her hopes. She met the birth, she learned of the sex of her son with bitter tears. And a wet nurse was hired, though there was no suggestion that Elizabeth would not have been capable of feeding the child herself. She appears from the very early days to have felt a detachment from her son. And Elizabeth's sister Mary was long concerned for Lowry's emotional development, or perhaps lack of emotional development. His mother never really formed a close bond. As a child, Lowry grew up to be a large, clumsy boy, one, and this again I think is significant, one who watches but doesn't join in, the spectator on the outside. He was extremely shy with strangers and diffident towards people of his own age. This, of course, was due to his mother's autocratic bearing and her increasing isolation. However, paradoxically, perhaps, Lowry shows himself to be and would remain to be a devoted son. There is an anecdote, believe it or not, that as a little boy, he would follow his mother around. He would carry a little wooden stool behind her when she went visiting or whatever. And whenever she felt tired, he would put the stool down and she could sit on the stool. He cared, of course, for her until her death. But Lowry says that he had no happy memories of his childhood. But I must tell you at this point of our little talk that I don't think you need so much a pinch of salt for Lowry's anecdotes and stories. Maybe a good fistful of salt might be an idea. As he was increasingly interviewed by reporters and for television, I think very often he said what he thought journalists wanted to hear. So you need to take his little stories and anecdotes with perhaps rather a large pinch of salt. He was educated privately at Grafton House. Don't think it was an enjoyable experience. He was teased and bullied. He never passed an exam in his life, and he was quite proud of the fact. At 15, he got his first job is in an estate agent's office, as well, partly rent collecting, partly on accounts. But of course, what he would have liked would have been to obtain a full-time place at art school. He applies, he is rejected. And his first job is as a humble clerk with Messrs. Thomas Aldred and Son in Mosley Street in Manchester. A career, you see, as an artist, certainly according to Mummy and Daddy, it wasn't an acceptable route to respectability in his parents' eyes. But for a man of such modest aspirations, by God, he had plenty that he achieved, didn't he, in his life. His work, these typical pictures from Artistic Phase 2, if you like, just a couple of them, extremely well known, of course. His work, if not completely unique, I can't think of many artists who captured in the way that he did, and which is there for us still to enjoy and wonder at. He captured the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution. You still don't have a great deal of problem seeing it, of course, on Tyneside or in Manchester, but it's getting less and less as the years go by. We owe Lowry a debt for having preserved it so well. I think of perhaps Norman Cornish's work or the Pitman painters. So we can't say Lowry is unique, but there were very few who could emulate him. He wanted, he says, to put the industrial scene on the map because nobody had done it. Nobody had done it seriously, at least he claims. Be no doubt about the financial value of his work. This picture, the going to, going to the match, that sold for £2 million in 1999. In January 2020, the mill Pendlebury sold for £2.6 million. There was public recognition, but it came so slowly. It was in 1953 that Lowry was appointed as one of the official artists for the coronation. And then in 1955, he became an associate member of the Royal Academy at the age merely of 69. He lived out most of his life before he even was admitted as an associate member. In the late 50s, the L.S.Lowry Gallery, I think we've got a slide of that, yes, was opened at Salford Art Gallery. It's a rare tribute to a living British artist. And this, as you can see from the picture, the gallery became the Lowry in 1999 during Salford Quay's regeneration. He had to wait, ladies and gentlemen, until he was 75 before he was admitted as a full academician in the Royal Academy. The post office recognised his talents. There was a 1 and 6penny stamp issued coming out of school. A pop band in 1968, Status Quo, had a hit with pictures of matchstick men. I'll spare you the song. Lowry would have hated that. He didn't like his figures being referred to as matchstick men. But it was quite a hit, wasn't it, for Status Quo? And probably the tribute he would have liked more than any other one was this 2011, except Lowry had been dead quite a while by then. 2011, there is a bronze statue unveiled in his favourite pub, Sam's Chop House. So we have modesty and achievement. Perhaps more of an obvious contrast is between rejection and acceptance. And really for about 30 years, until the Second World War almost, he painted on lonely in evening classes or at home. He painted on with little recognition or understanding. His mother, Elizabeth, found his work ugly and pointless. Other Manchester artists sneered and laughed at his so-called amateurish work, which they found provincial or even primitive. The head of sculpture at the art school, a Professor Millard, said they, meaning the, I hesitate to use the word, the little stick figures, the homunculi all look like marionettes. And if you pull the strings, I think we've got a picture, if you look at the little stick figures, they all look like marionettes, he said. And if you pull the string, they would all cock their legs up. Ordinary Manchester and Salford people felt, I think to some extent with justification, that Lowry was giving a very sordid impression of their cities. I can get it. Excuse my terrible Mancunian accent. I know there's at least one Mancunian in the audience tonight. I do my best. I can get on a number 8 bus and see that bloody sight for tuppence any day, seemed to have been the common reaction. However, in 1917, at the age of 30, Lowry is finally granted student membership of the Manchester Academy of Fine Arts, and he's allowed to present work for the annual exhibition at Manchester City Art Gallery. He submits 3 works, a 15 guinea, a 6 guinea, a 4 guinea one, and none are sold. He'll not exhibit here again until 1932. A few years later, 1921, he has his first public show, not in an art gallery, but in an architect's office. He submits 25 oils and 2 pastels. None sell. However, the Manchester Guardian's art critic at least says the artist's technique is not yet equal to his ideas. If he can learn to express himself with ease and style, he may make a real contribution to art. Maybe, but not very likely. Rejection and slow acceptance. Starts early enough in a way. In fact, as early as 1919, he makes his first sale to a 17-year-old art student, a friend, in fact, of Lowry's mother. I couldn't believe it. And my mother said to her, you mustn't buy them. He'll give them to you if you want them, my dear. But she insists, and she buys one. And then to Lowry's utter astonishment, she buys 9 more. And then Lowry tells us, better get that pinch of salt ready. And then Lowry says he returned home immediately after, or a few weeks after, I don't know. He returned home fed up. and he decides to burn all his drawings. But just then a friend arrived, stopped him, and bought the drawings. Now, whether that anecdote happened then with the young art student or many years later, we cannot be sure. The anecdote crops up a couple of times in Lowry's accounts. We don't know. The exhibition, though, that he had in 1921 had attracted some attention, and in particular from the director of Oldham Art Gallery, one a Mr. Berry, who had visited the exhibition, recognised that the man perhaps had some talent. He keeps in touch with Lowry, eventually inviting him home, where Lowry meets Mr. Berry's wife, one Daisy Jewell, who would play a very important part in promoting Lowry's work. Daisy Jewell commuted between Manchester and London every week. She was deeply involved in the London art world. She worked for Bourlet and Sons, fine art agents, and she appears to have had almost unflinching faith in Lowry's talents long before others recognised them. And she would make sure, wherever possible, that Lowry's work would be presented as far afield as Paris. In fact, it was presented in numerous exhibitions, although he still sold very, very little. Maybe his paintings were just too painfully close to the reality of hard times and poverty for many people to find attractive. In 1930, Lowry, now aged 45, achieves his first one-man exhibition in Ancoats, a suburb of Manchester. His work now is actually highly praised for its increasing maturity of style and, believe it or not, Manchester City Art Gallery by the accident. All his pictures now are sold, but Lowry felt that the prices were set far too low. Not even the price of a bricklayer or a navvy, he claims. In 1932, things get a little bit better, slowly but gradually. 2 pictures are finally accepted by the Royal Academy, and in 1934, he's elected a member of the Royal Society of British Artists. And then in 1939, he is elected a member of he has his first one-man show in London. Daisy Jewell is a bit sneaky here in her strategy. I'm certain Mr. McNeill Reid, who is the director of the Lefebvre Gallery in London, comes to her gallery to look over possible work for the exhibition. And Daisy Jewell has left, just by chance, you understand, a few Lowrys lying around the studio. What's this, he says, what's that? He quite likes these Lowrys, and they get into the exhibition through the back door, almost, it seems. Things seem to be getting promising, and a second exhibition is promised, but a small event got in the way in September 1939, and it was 1945, in fact, before Lowry made his first financial profit, which of course explains why throughout his life he had the day job and then the evening and weekend work as well. In 1948, he has his first Manchester show. The Manchester Guardian comments, it's strange that an artist who was in his early 30s when he began to know exactly what he wanted to paint should have to wait until he was 60 before holding his first one-man show in his native city. There was certainly a certain hostility between Lowry and other Manchester artists. But after the war, success became more and more firmly established. He becomes, as you know, a successful artist, but that long period of rejection had left him a bitter man. He declines honours. He was offered an OBE by Harold Macmillan. He was offered a knighthood by Harold Wilson. They offered me a knighthood, and I wouldn't touch it. I have very strong opinions about honours. They're 10 a penny. I didn't want it at all. I'm not a socialist. I'm a good conservative, but I didn't want a title. And Lowry always had a very refreshing attitude towards pretentious people, particularly pretentious artists. He doesn't even describe himself as an artist. I'm not an artist. I'm just a man who paints as a hobby, perhaps. And of the perhaps more bohemian artistic arty companions around him, many of whom would sport little goatee beards, he said, the longer the beard, the shorter the art. At a cocktail party, which he would have hated to go to, when asked what would Sir like to drink, he would like to drink tomato soup. He goes to an academy, the Royal Academy dinner. He only goes to one. He's ignored by the other members, but he eats his way single-handedly through a full tureen of potatoes, which sat in front of him at the table. He would turn up at the Royal Academy on occasion, wearing an old raincoat, battered trilby, greeting all the members in a broad Lancashire accent with the words, "How's trade going?" He doesn't refer to his studio as a studio, it's just a workroom. And dealers, art dealers, they're just really grocers who happen to sell paintings. He was a private and a lonely man, but on the other hand, he certainly did have friends, quite a lot of friends, and he could in fact be a very gregarious, friendly person. The private man. Well, his loneliness, and I think we've touched on this already, his loneliness is the loneliness of the man in the crowd. My temperament, he says, this makes me rather sad, my temperament made me very unsociable, but that was not my wish. Was it his upbringing? Was it his rejection? I don't know. I can't answer the question. His appearance perhaps didn't help. He was a tall, gangly youth. His head was covered with thick, sandy hair, rather like a boiled egg with pepper on the top. He had a funny way of walking, a bit like a puppet manipulated by a hand too small for the glove. And this led to him being teased by children because of his appearance. He didn't fit in, no surprise here, at those evening art classes that he attended for so many years. He's considered odd in the classes, not unfriendly. Many, though not all, of his tutors considered him almost unteachable. He used to sit in front of a nude model, and by the time he had finished, it looked as if it had been carved with a meat axe. And he kept the various aspects of his life in hermetically sealed jars, if you like. He had a very secretive attitude, for example, to his day job. He didn't want his work colleagues to know that he worked as an artist. He didn't want artist colleagues to know what he did during the day. He reacted furiously to a Guardian article of 1933, which claimed, Mr. Lowry, let the cat out of the bag, you see, the Guardian article. Mr. Lowry is the assistant secretary to a Manchester firm of estate agents and does much of his work in the evenings. Ah, so he doesn't just go home and put his feet up after he's been out rent collecting and do the accounts. He has another job. And the artist will say, good God, he's a peintre de dimanche. He's just a Sunday painter. He's got to work. He's got to support himself with a commoner garden job. And it was a pretty humble, though invaluable experience, the job that he carried out during the day. At work, Lowry gives the impression that art was just a hobby. He didn't come in and boast of his latter-day successes, just a hobby for his spare time. And on the eve of his retirement, he'd only stayed with the firm for a mere 42 years. On the eve of his retirement, he simply said to his colleagues, "Goodbye, I shan't be in tomorrow." End of story. And we can see, of course, in his creative work, the reflection of his need for privacy. They are impersonal figures who do not touch. For Lowry, every human being stands alone in the last extremity, and that is how I see it. The tragic vision, if you like. There's quite often a barrier in the paintings, keeping him, others out. The pavement, a fence, or iron railings. There are some writers of Lowry's life who suggest he suffered from Asperger's syndrome, though I take that with a bit of a pinch of salt. And yet, he certainly had the ability to isolate himself from a crowd, and he did compartmentalize his friends. He would take up friends for a few years and then leave them and move on. And none of the, or few of these friends knew about other friends. He didn't try to develop a network of friends. He did have difficulty in forming relationships, yet he disliked a show of emotion. And yet, you know, he could, in company, he could be funny, articulate, and sociable. And yes, he certainly did develop friendships, usually, though not entirely in artistic circles. There was the young office lad that he worked with called Clifford Openshaw. This young lad also attended art classes. He was quite a good amateur artist. And Lowry would listen to Clifford. He would listen to him with interest and respect his ideas and art. And Clifford was equally impressed with the mutual respect that Lowry showed to his tenants on his rounds as rent collector. There were Hugh and Mary Maitland. Hugh is an amateur artist, and he's also incidentally a professor of bacteria. And the Maitlands adopt, if that's the correct word, adopt Lowry and make him feel welcome in their Manchester home. They also introduce him to Alex and Catherine Lang. At Lowry's invitation, the Langs visit Lowry and they buy 3 of Lowry's industrial scenes, which no doubt they managed to turn into a very handsome profit later on. Lowry is astonished by their enthusiasm for his work, but a friendship developed, and they developed regular visits to concerts and to the Lang's house in Droylsden, Manchester. He found Lowry much encouragement from the enthusiasm shown by both the Maitlands and the Langs. Then there was David Carr. You all heard of Carr's biscuits. Well, David Carr was the son of the wealthy biscuit manufacturer and an official war artist. A friendship developed between David Carr and Lowry during the war, with Lowry being invited to the Carr's house in Norfolk. There, the latter's children find Lowry a fascinating character, and they start walking around the streets identifying or trying to identify Lowry figures, perhaps not to the great delight of the people so identified. And perhaps, as we'll see in a few moments or two, perhaps the couple who gave him most support and comfort were the Timpleys, and Edith and Harold Timpley. Lowry became a regular visitor to their flat, and he enjoyed their musical evenings with their literary friends, sitting there, enjoying their company, but without completely fitting in. Lowry, of course, I don't know if he was a typical bachelor, whatever that means. He was certainly a bachelor, and yet he liked and he had dealings with women. I'll explain what I mean there. Because of his mother's dominant influence, it meant that Lowry, he didn't really have a normal childhood with the opportunities of meeting many other boys and girls, teenagers of his own years. His emotional development was hindered because of his mother's detachment, we think, from him. And he gives us this advice, which maybe it's good advice, maybe it's not, but he says to us, don't be like me. Don't build your life around your parents. Marry and make a life of your own. There you go. He doesn't really, however, seem to have any normal interest in women as women. The other students at the evening college said of him, of course, there were lots of attractive young girl artists working and learning away alongside Lowry. Did he take any notice of them? Well, they said it might as well, instead of being a bunch of pretty young women, it might have been a bunch of retired policemen for all the interest Lowry showed in them. His mother dies at 83 in 1939, and Lowry is left totally desolate, despite the coldness that had been shown on her side, if not on his. He's left totally desolate, it seems, and it'll take him a long time to recover. After her death, he locks the room, and it's a full year later that he paints a picture of this room from memory. It's a sterile, empty room with an empty bed draped with a counterpane of purest white. What now, he claims, was the purpose in anything, even life itself, if she was not to share it? Remember the Timperleys, Edith and Harold Timperley? Well, Harold Timperley finds Lowry soon after the funeral, sitting hunched on a seat in Manchester Art Gallery. Harold Timperley takes him home to his wife, who cares for him for 3 weeks to try to put him back on his feet. And Lowry will now live alone for the rest of his life. And he buys his first and last house in Mottram, in Longondale, to the east of Manchester. He buys it several years after, in 1948, when he's forced to leave Pendlebury when the landlord takes the house back. And I don't think he probably was a particularly good neighbour, perhaps not noisy, but he had no interest in the house or the garden. He used drawing pins to hold up the peeling wallpaper. He would have perhaps liked to have lived something of a hermit's existence if that had been allowed to him. So where do women come in to all this? You probably recognize this picture. I doubt if it's a real woman, but I don't know. It's perhaps some sort of composite. He talks about the Anne figure. Was there a long and unsuccessful search for an ideal woman? Or was Anne, she seems to have gone under various names, or was Anne just an imaginary figure, the personification of a girl forever young, forever innocent and vulnerable? Well, there was at least one girl he knew who was actually called Anne. There was one girl who lived nearby in Pendlebury, whose company, innocent company, he appears to have enjoyed, and this Anne would come in to help with Lowry's aging mother. But Lowry tells us that Anne died while still a young girl in 1913. Did she really die, or do we need that pinch of salt? We don't know. But this, of course, is what makes Lowry such an intriguing figure, because we cannot be categorical about a great deal of his life story. There was another girl, he calls her Maud, but the name is irrelevant. Maud apparently was a dancer who had given it all up, and Lowry and Maud would take long walks together. But she, perhaps conveniently, but she also died tragically young. She came to my father's funeral, you know, and she caught a cold and died. So that dispatched her as well. So I don't know whether the Annes and the Mauds were real women, syntheses of women, maybe, but there certainly were several real women. One of the notable ones was a Kathleen Leatherbarrow, and Lowry established a friendship first with her parents. But then, and I had to take a double take on this, but then Lowry asks the 13-year-old, Lowry now is 50 years of age, he asks Kathleen to go to a pantomime with him. Well, I think nowadays one would have to think very hard about that. He did. It was perfectly innocent. And this friendship with Catherine lasted for 8 years until Catherine married. And she says of Lowry that she felt that Lowry was using her childhood vicariously, as if he had had no childhood of his own. And I can understand that comment. The picture of Kathleen in her wren uniform remained on Lowry's piano for the rest of his life. But what does seem to be beyond doubt, as far as any of us can know, is that he behaved correctly with these young women. There were several. He behaved correctly at all times. It appears there's no suggestion of anything sordid in the relationship. But of course, the woman who benefited most from friendship with Lowry was Carol Ann Lowry. Now, be careful. I don't think this Carol Ann was a relative. Of course, she's called Anne. That's very symbolic, the name for Lowry. And she is called Lowry, and it's spelled, in fact, the same. She later marries, becomes Carol Spears. And what a strange coincidence. What a strange way that this acquaintance took place. Carol Lowry's family, or her mother, struggled in Haywood, part of Manchester. Carol's mother, Carol Ann Lowry, Carol's mother had left her husband, but she had ambitions for her daughter. All her ambitions revolved around her daughter. To make them have a chance of coming true, she had 3 jobs to make ends meet. She worked in a mill, in a Bury tripe shop, and in a hotel. And she one evening persuaded her daughter to write a letter to Lowry, asking primarily for advice on studying art, which seems fair enough and genuine. In the letter, though, she suggests that her daughter put in to ask simply, is there any possibility that we are related? After all, we share the same family name. Maybe, maybe not. Lowry receives the letter and in his normal absent-minded way reads it quickly and stuffs it into his wallet, forgets about it more or less. And months pass by, and then in the street in Manchester, he sees a bus, and on the indicator board it says Haywood. And on the spur of the moment, he jumps on the bus and he goes and he knocks on Carol Ann Lowry and her mother's door. Mother is at work. Carol Ann does not allow him in, and I don't think he would have wanted to go in. He mopes around the streets for an hour or so and goes back and is admitted, Carol Ann's mother now being at home. And on that first evening, ladies and gentlemen, on that first evening, Lowry arranges to pay the convent school fees for Mrs. Lowry's daughter. He offers and is accepted to help pay the rent, and he arranges for her to attend classes at Rochdale College of Art. Now, how impetuous can you become on that very first evening? The relationship, if that's the word I'm looking for, develops. It appears that are actually highly unlikely to be related. But on a visit to London with Carol Ann, she she suggests they call in at Somerset House to check the birth certificates. Lowry reacts furiously to this. He refuses absolutely to entertain the idea. Probably he would be frightened in case the myth would be shattered. He didn't want to know whether or not they were related. And it seems, as I say, fairly unlikely that they were. Lowry took the young lass on visits around Manchester, and then later he took her away on holidays to quite expensive hotels in London, in the north, to Sunderland, and a little more on Sunderland just before we finished, or to Scotland. And Carol Lowry, comes to the conclusion that actually she was simply the tag end of what I will call the Anne thing. I was fortunate, enormously fortunate, that I was the last. She was very fortunate because she will inherit Lowry's, not perhaps fortune, but considerable assets when he dies. Was there a darker side? I don't know. But there were discovered on Lowry's death, the executors discovered pictures much more alarming, in fact, than these ones I'm showing you. Beautiful but disturbing paintings of young girls. The executive showed these as they felt they had to Anne after Lowry's death. Now, some of them are delicate, tender, but many are violent and bloody. There's a head severed from the body with an axe. There's a body prostrate under a guillotine. One has an enormous collar strangling a head. Another has a metal belt restraining the victim. At first, and I think we would react in the same way as Carol Ann did, she was shocked by these grotesque figures. But then she interprets them, I don't know whether she's right or not, she interprets them as an expression of Lowry's inner frustration and pain of which he could never speak. And I move to the final contrast, contradiction, whatever you want to call it, of this complex character. There was frugality, but there was also generosity. To himself, he was pretty mean. In 1972, as a well-established, successful artist, making money. In 1972, net profits are about £50,000. His expenses? Oh, £47. Heating and lighting, £69. That's it. He never drank, he never smoked, he had 2 or 3 suits, he never owned a TV or a car, he never went abroad. He even didn't have a telephone until a burglary at his house, and he had no, no live-in housekeeper. He saw money simply as a measure of the public's desire for his work. The money was not there, he tells us, to be spent. It sits in the bank, gathering dust, like the clocks and china in the house. But he was shrewd enough, and he knew when people were trying to con him, as dealers would occasionally, or perhaps not even occasionally do, he felt quite often perhaps a little bit like a winning race course feels after the race. It's the trainers and the jockeys who get the big money rewards. The poor old horse gets a bag of carrots, perhaps. He felt a bit like the racehorse. A dealer comes to his house to buy a number of signed prints. They agree a price of £5 per print, and there are perhaps a dozen prints, 5 12s, that would be £60. Here's the cheque. Lowry does a quick calculation. That's not £5 per signed print. That's £3. Doesn't say anything to the dealer, however, who thinks he's onto a good thing here. He begins to sign the first print L.S.L.O.W, hands it over, and so on. Says the dealer, "Excuse me, you've not finished your signature. Where's the R and the Y?" "Lowry, that's a small signature for a small fee. When I get the other £2, you shall get the other 2 letters." He enjoyed entertaining, again, I don't think that's the word, dealers from the soft south. Lowry didn't seem to go in for heating his house very much. And he would judge how keen, how determined a dealer was by how long it was before he froze to death, or whether his greed would get the better of him. The longer he could last in this frigid house in the winter, obviously the greedier was the dealer. So he was a mean man. Or was he a mean man? Well, he could be generous. He could be generous to himself, never mind others, but to himself, for example, he indulged in taxis, not so much for their convenience, but he liked the congenial company, and he would ask the opinion of his taxi drivers. There would be long journeys, Mottram to Sunderland, which would cost a fair bit by taxi, I would have thought. They would stay in Sunderland at the Seaburn Hotel, which looks rather different, but they certainly still remember Lowry if you visit the hotel. Lowry loved seascapes. This one is Seaburn, of course. He also, well, he knew the Northeast quite well, of course. You could easily do a talk on Lowry, the Northeast. Here's one for South Shields. It's been suggested, perhaps with tongue-in-cheek, however, that Lowry, he could put South Shields on the map. Lowry perhaps could do for South Shields what Gauguin has done for Tahiti. Well, maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration. We don't know. He also liked to purchase paintings, particularly pre-Raphaelites. But of course, it's mainly with regard to other people that we can see his generosity. There is 2 women artists. There's Pat Cook. Her father brought Pat as a 14-year-old to Lowry's house for advice on drawing. She then started to visit him regularly for lessons, and he helped her to obtain a place at the Slade. And he visited her in London as her father might visit his daughter. She became a successful owner in her own right, but the relationship faded out on her marriage. Pat says, "He did tire of people, you know. He tired of everyone sooner or later. Each friend had their allotted lifespan, and when it was done, he moved on." There's a second artist, Sheila Fell, a young painter he meets first in 1955 when he buys 2 of her paintings from a London exhibition. A year later, he takes her for a meal. He asks to meet her parents and offers to help her financially, £3 a week. And Sheila Fell went on to become a Royal Academician. The friendship would last until Lowry's death, and she felt she owed an enormous gratitude for all his help and advice. But of course, it was to Carol Ann Lowry that, at least certainly in financial terms, that he showed his greatest generosity. In his will, he leaves nearly £300,000 in money, house, and paintings. But as the years went by, and Lowry lived on alone in far from a comfortable situation. He lives on alone, and the strain of organizing exhibitions, he was always being hurried and pressurized to exhibit, the strain from exhibitions, the strain from interviews, this weighed him down more and more. And we can see here an old, rather sad-looking man here. He came eventually, I think, to have a rather welcoming attitude to death. I think he said, in the end, you know, this was at 89 years of age, I think in the end, you get tired of it, meaning, of course, life. And death came on the February the 23rd, 1976 to Lowry in Glossop. He had a stroke, followed by pneumonia. But at least, ladies and gentlemen, he had achieved his last ambition. He had become a burden to no one. He died as he had lived, alone, with dignity, with courage. And 9 months after he was laid to rest, there is finally a full exhibition at the Royal Academy. Like most things in Lowry's life, it came too late. Thank you very much.